Hi everyone, I'm Andrea Green, Director of the Visiting Artist Program here at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's presentation by Brazilian artist Beatriz Milhazes. SAIC's Visiting Artist Program was formalized in 1951 and has a rich history of presenting distinguished artists and scholars to the SAIC and Chicago communities. We are honored to welcome Beatriz Milhazes to the school, and we are grateful for the time she has taken to be here this evening. This visit has been in the works for the past couple of years, so we're very excited to have her here with us tonight. I would like to thank the Illinois Arts Council Agency for their support of tonight's program, as well as SAIC's Department of Painting and Drawing for their involvement with Beatriz's visit. You can find additional information about the Visiting Artist Program by visiting saic.edu, where you can download available podcasts of previous lectures, articles on our guests, and also sign up to receive e-news. We'll have time after the lecture for some questions from the audience. Our staff will have microphones circulating, so please raise your hands so we can get a microphone to you for your question. And tonight's lecture concludes our fall season, and please keep an eye out. Our spring schedule will be announced in just a couple of weeks. And introducing our guest this evening is Terry Myers, Chair of SAIC's Department of Painting and Drawing. Thank you.
It is my great pleasure to introduce Beatriz Milhazes. Born in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in 1960, where she continues to live and work, Milhazes has gained well-deserved international attention over her nearly 30-year career. Recently, she has said that, quote, "The first decade of my career in the 1980s was very local. It was only in the 1990s that I started showing work outside of Brazil, first in Latin America, Mexico, Venezuela, and then in New York. Then came Europe and Japan, but all very gradually, little by little. During that process, sometimes I would leave for a bit and spend time in these other countries, but I never cut my ties with Rio. And that was an important decision. I need to feel that link with home, that understanding of what home is." Close quote. The power of Milhazes' work comes from her ability to maintain that link. Her brightly colored abstract paintings are inspired by the natural surroundings of her home country, along with the decorative forms that come from Carnival and local folk art. Emerging from its roots in Brazilian and European modernism, as well as in particular the baroque, her work is hybrid in the best way, a cultural and historical mashup that brings to my mind the famous claim by the Weimar theorist Siegfried Kracauer, who in his 1927 text, The Masked Ornament, said, quote, "An analysis of the simple surface manifestations of an epoch can contribute more to determining its place in the historical process than judgments of the epoch about itself," close quote. In her commitment to painting as an inextricably visual, conceptual, and material enterprise, Milhazes demonstrates, alongside her peers, including Polly Apfelbaum, Larry Pittman, and Philip Taft, that any dismissive use of the word decorative is more likely than not a refusal to accept that decoration is in its very nature social, if not political. As Milhazes told the fashion designer Christian Lacroix in a tremendous interview published in 2004, and I would encourage you to read this interview. This is a quote from her. "These references are associated with the country's poorest social groups, and they don't concern intellectuals and people in art. They have a pejorative connotation, but I've always used them. But I think that this relationship has changed a bit today. The elite have begun to attach importance to the fact of being Brazilian, of having Brazilian art, and these folk references are increasingly accepted," close quote. Milhazes has had over 50 solo exhibitions since 1985 at venues including the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation in Lisbon, the Fondation in Basel, the Fondation Cartier in Paris, and most recently, a major retrospective at the Centro Cultural Paco Imperial in Rio de Janeiro, her first show in her home city in more than a decade. She has participated in numerous group exhibitions, including the Sao Paulo Biennales of 1998 and 2004, the 2003 Venice Biennale, and the 1998 Sydney Biennial. Her work is in numerous collections, including the Museum of Art, Museum of Modern Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Guggenheim Museum, all in New York. Almost done. The San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the 21st Century Museum of Contemporary Art in Kanazawa, Japan, and the Museo Nacional Centro d'Art Reina Sophía in Madrid, and the Museo Nacional de Bellas Artes in Rio de Janeiro. Please join me in welcoming Beatriz Milhazes.
So, thank you, Terry. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, the Art Institute, to invite me to this visiting artist program. What is for me is always very interesting when I can. I was a teacher during 10 years, between 86 to 96, but then I needed to really stop teaching, and because of my development of my career, and I needed to really put aside of my life this kind of educational part of it. And so it's always a pleasure when I can include in my year traveling programs schedule some to be with the students again. So so then I decided to have, I hope it's not too long, I hope it's not too many images, as actually I'm completing 30 years working as my first show, the first time I show my work, it was in '83, so, but the first decade, the first 80, in the way we are in a school, so I think for the students, and some of the questions actually the students I met during this two days studio visit, they asked me questions. I said, no, it's better to wait for the lecture because so I decided to go to the very beginning, what it was this is 81. So I did these first two works, still in the school. And I had a kind of a difference because in Rio, I wanted to be a journalist, not an artist. And so when I went to the university, I selected journalism and social communication. And then at the second year, I understood it was not exactly my thing. And then my mother, who is an art historian teacher at the Rio University, suggests to me, why you don't go to the art school? And then when I visited the art school in Rio, what is a Escola de Artes Visuais do Collage, what still is the best art school we have. When I visited, I immediately thought, no, that's what I want to do. And then I finished my graduation in journalism because I want a degree, and this art school is not exactly a college or not exactly a university, because the art universities in Rio are kind of a very old mind, very academic, not in a good way, in a good sense. So I'm explaining all that to tell you that I have the program that this school run is a kind of they have artists, and the artists develop themselves, their own program to the students. And of course, they have a more major coordinated overseeing all this program. So I did a kind of a basic when I entered the school, and then right after, I always want to be a painter, and then I select this teacher, what actually he is Scottish. So he is not Brazilian. And so for me, I mention it because it was very important to have him as my teacher. So this very first was connected with part of, it was when I started developing my own language, but it was very much based on his proposals that was between the link, like bidimensional and three-dimensional. So painting as an object, if you want to, if I can say that in English. So, and then my paintings were basically, very, the idea I have, it was kind of a mathematical. So I have the patterns, I have the carnival fabrics that I always had this interest to use things from the carnival party, especially in Brazil, always motivate me to be an artist. Even I am a conceptual carnavalesque. I'm not really, I don't go to the parades, but it's like I like the wideness, the way the freedom they have to put all the things together. And so always motivate. So I was, by that time, I was using this. And then when I opened my studio and when I start really start being on my own, you can see like this very first. First I stopped using color. And then I was just on white, grays, and a kind of I never really worked with black, but I had always this dark grayish. And then I was involved, I always liked this baroque, like possibility of representations, also like the churches, so the angels came along by the donut. And I start feeling connected with Cubism, so I'm saying that because to show very the beginning. And of course the construction that were, or a kind of order or system that were on the patterns, on the fabric patterns that I used before, start arriving again based on the repetition that finally took me to this 87, and actually it's not an 87, this one, no. And like 88 works I did during this more or less 1 year. I did only five canvas that were, I developed this drawing that was based on a flowers vase, and then I arrive on this shape, and then I repeat. So I paint, I think 5 or 6 paintings. They all had exactly the same grid of rectangles, and I repeat the same shape in every square, and then based on this first kind of a scheme, I start trying to make different kinds of compositions or possibilities for the same elements, for the same kind of surface. And when I did it, I used different kind of, I always work with acrylic painting since then, forever, but there, I was printing on canvas and then cut out of canvas, and then I was gluing fabrics. So I kind of went back to my very early work, but with a different kind of system. And then actually these 5 paintings I show, it was my first show in Sao Paulo, a city in Rio, so it's my first solo. And then when I finished the show, I had, like, for the first time, my first, like, a crisis. Because actually, with these kind of, I don't know how to say in English, but like kind of a grid, I don't know, with all this square and all this very rational system that I try to resolve as a composition, I became a kind of a prison to myself. And so I felt really like I was inside the jail, not the paint. So I decided I needed to really experimenting. So I started experimenting using this technique because I always loved to work with the collage idea, because the collage gave to you a kind of a possibility of bringing to the paintings something that's out of paintings, some context that's out of paintings, to work with existing materials too, and have a kind of a control about the images. I love painting, but I never really like a painterly brush strokes showing up. So that's why I use a lot of printing. During this time, I use printing over the canvas and then cut out afterwards. And then I started experimenting based on a monotype with a kind of a plastic sheet, very simple process. And then I figured out that some of the painting that remain on the plastic sheet, I could afterward, after it's dry, I could transfer it to the canvas, to another surface. And then I figured out, okay, if I can do it, I will be able to make my own images on this plastic sheet, and then afterwards to transfer it to the canvas. And then when that was a big and very strong discovery to my work, because that made me, and this painting especially, is a very important in the way, like you can see the passage between, when you see the stripes, the red part is lace glued. So I had a lace glued, and then I painted on top of the lace, like kind of reordering the existing order of the lace motifs. And then the blue and the beige part, it was already this technique. At the beginning was like, you can see, like it's very rough, not very well defined the areas. So I was, all these images there, I painted actually on a plastic. I make a film, and there's this, when it's thick enough, I glue it on the canvas, and when it's dry, I take out I peel off the plastic, and then the plastic sheet, and then it stay the image. So that was a big, huge opening to my work, because I could still working with the collage concept or process. At the same time, it was all painting, because I was very using just fabrics and papers or my own printing or something like that. It became very limited. And so I wanted to really created my own images, but I could not using existing. So that opened this door. Another thing, it was about the colors, because in the way I paint over this plastic thing, it's like the plastic doesn't really absorb any of the painting, what keeps the intensity of the colors I make. And also, if you talk about metallic, gold, copper, silver, or any other colorful metallic colors, also it looks like it sometimes is like gold leaf, or even it's not, it's all acrylic paint, but it's because of this technique too. And of course, I have collage in different ways, like I have the motifs on my hands, and then I can move around and try to figure it out before I really glue it, where would be a best place to glue it. So in the 90s, so I will just, I hope I had in the order. So until more or less the half the first 5 years or 6 years of the 90s, I go back afterwards. So what happened, so I give freedom to the images. And then actually, like going back, so I think I have, for me, I always felt very connected with the modernism, the Brazilian and the European ones. And the Brazilian, they were trying to, it called like a cannibalism, like when the major figure, like in the Brazilian modernism, the painter Tarsila do Amaral, she studied in Paris painting with Leger, and then when our modernism happens in the 30s. And so she studied with Leger in Paris, and then when she went back to Brazil, she realized that she could not just working there without thinking about her own environment. And so she, with another group of artists and also writers, they developed this statement that it calls cannibalism that we can thinking about. So I always felt connected with this movement because even much later, I had the same thing. I had my Scottish teacher, paintings, all the meaning of paintings is like, is connected. It's coming from Europe and then from North America on a contemporary time, and not exactly from my country. And so, and I always were very involved with the nature, the strong nature that I have around me, all these possibilities of parades or manifestations, like a kind of folk parties, or, well, things that comes from my hometown, specifically in Rio. And so these, I want to use it in my paintings, so on my paintings, and that's it's also like Brazilian. Brazil is a very mixed culture, so we had such of a different things that comes from decorative art, folk art, applied art. So all these things always motivated me to be an artist, and I wanted to work with it on my paintings, and then this technique gave me this possibility because I could develop, I could work. So here you can see like this period of time, I was actually very connected with the Hispanic, a more Hispanic culture that comes from church in general, baroque such, but more heavy. So my gold, when I use gold there, the gold was coming from more the architecture, Catholic church, and all this environment, and also these, and also like some garments and for women dress, women work from the 18th century, 19th century. Handmade work too is like from the lace to crochet, all these structures and manifestations I wanted to use too. But as I was talking with some of the students today, it's like when you get in the studio, you need to forget everything because it's like you never will paint a crochet. So. And then you need to forget because actually painting is about form, color, structure, order, and then you needed to forget all your interests and then try to construct something. Unfortunately, all the other titles are in the original language. Sometimes they're mostly here in Portuguese, so you probably don't understand. And the 5 lens is acrylic sobre tela, is acrylic over on canvas. And the size is in meters, sorry, it's not inches. So they're pretty big, like 195. I use like these, unfortunately, they are not in inches. So I feel like a geometric artist because actually what I think, what I make is trying to make some order, organize some order. So towards the end of the 90s, I think I arrived on the point like I have 2 roads to take, and it was pretty clear for me that or based on all these elements that I just spoke about, like I could take like a more figurative side, a more maybe dramatic, or more, I don't know. Yeah, I think figurative would be a good idea, even with all these structures, but based on more visible or understandable images. Or I would really take responsibility about being an abstract artist, what actually it is what I always been. And but I remember that was a clear decision that, okay, what I wanted is to be an abstract and really take responsibility of it. And so the paintings start being some elements from pop art, the optical, because when I talk about colors in my work, like of course the color is a very important thing. When I talk about colors, I talk about conflicts, strong contrast is what always interests me. When and I think it's the colors from the late 90s to the 2000s, they start gain more intensity and became more lighter, more strong, more like vibrant. And I really start also to introduce with more, I don't know how to say in English, but like it became something more visible in the work, the intensity, and some symbols, like the peace and love symbols, like the hurt, some pop symbols too, start getting in. So the original lace or crochet got a little fat, like had some more bigger space and became kind of a grid, but a kind of also a possibility of making the colors. So from that point, so I think like in 2000, I think my very first show, I felt myself, well, finally I arrived somewhere, I can express what I wanted visually, like with plasticity on painting. It was in a show I did in Rio de Janeiro in the 90s. That show, I really felt like, okay, now I arrived somewhere. And then from that point, I start to, of course, moving forward, different steps you cross over. And so in the 2000s, by this moment that when I really took responsibility over the abstraction, it was a new period of time. So I don't like to pass too fast, but at the same time, I have so many images that you'll not believe. So here is a good example with some of the things I introduced right at the beginning, because, and then I have a kind of method, like trying to push always the work forward. I always, when I am in the studio working in a group of paintings, I always introduce some new questions. And it's like a scientist that I was talk with one of the students today. Like I think we have a lot of communications, like a lot of dialogue, good dialogues with science. Like in a way, like you can just jump some questions, and these start like a kind of a chain reaction, and then you react to it, and that is the process that is very interesting. So, by that time, I start working with imagination too, because I think like I had a kind of a touch on the surrealism and the abstract art, like the optical art from the 60s, 70s, and like a surrealism from the past. So I have this kind of imaginary landscapes. So you also will see like some of the works based on this work was the first one I worked, I made a painting, really trying to make a kind of a written. Of course, all the paintings had a kind of a connection with music in terms of written, but this one, it was the only one until that point that I really work thinking about it. Here, 2002, 2003, I introduce two things. 2001, I saw like Bridget Raleigh, this a British painter, that's the master from the art, and I was like her work, and I always wanted to do this kind of a disturbing of for your eyes sight. So, and when I saw a retrospective of her at the Dia Center in New York in 2001. I finally, because you notice like the circle has been the geometric shape that I most use for different reasons. First, because it's like it's very organic and it had no stop, and you don't really, I like it when you never really stop anywhere, and you keep moving your eyes, and also there are no centers. I work with circle, but they are all moving you somewhere. You never really stop anywhere. You don't have a selection of centers. And is but I wanted to, as an introduction to new questions. So the straight lines, squares, were always very difficult for me, exactly because I could not really make it happen and doing like a stop. It's always work as a stop for your eyes, and I found really difficult until I visited this show, and then I finally understood what actually is not so difficult, but like that, of course, with the colors, with the stripes, with the movements you can make with the colors, you can, of course, continue the written like you can have with the circles. And then I introduce the stripes that you have seen already here, and the squares. Then the composition starts being really complex, like putting together all these elements and all this very clear structure. From this period, like 2004, 2005, the squares start taking a very strong position, and the paintings start being really structured on that point. So what happened in 2003, so I had this, I started working with collage paper on paper, what I never really did before. And so the collage starts a new communication, a dialogue with my paintings. It's very interesting that I went backwards to the collage things, but also not thinking about painting, but thinking about collage paper cut out. I will show later, like this thing. So the collage started interfering in the paintings as the works I start doing for like a kind of a site-specific that I start making for buildings, for sometimes public space, but most of them were connected with museums, institutions, and connected with shows of my work. And so the drawings, because I never really draw, my work is a lot about process, but since 2004, when I made my first project for the Selfridges department store in Manchester, in England, I needed to work on a plan, an architectural plan, and make the drawings there. That twisted my way of looking at images, my way of looking and going back to my paints afterwards, because it changed my drawing, the possibility of making some of the works. And then they start being influenced by these results, because by these drawings, like the shapes start crossing one another, instead of just opposing, the colors became more, all the shapes became a bit more clean and more visible. I start leaving more, the colors has its own life, not always being working on a confrontation of a big contrast. This is a very good example. Also, when I start looking to the abstract art in itself. It's not that I haven't done it before, but then the abstract art was a strong reference, like some symbols or some very important examples of abstract art in the history. In the more recent work, from 2011-12 to now, I kind of start looking for two interesting things that arrived. For the first, I thought the work started being too clean, or too, like the results of some of the surfaces were too shape it somewhere. So I wanted to go back to this kind of more, that has showing more the process, showing more a kind of a memory that I had on my, on the plastic sheet that I work with, just let things a bit, give some freedom to certain areas again. And so I based on two things. Analyze first using the, you see afterwards like how I use the drawing afterwards, but looking for tribals drawings and make a kind of research about it. And also like to really make the colors happen based on grids, actually, on a kind of a big cross. And also the synetical is not how, I don't know how you call this in English, I forgot that. Synetic artist? No. It's huh? No. I forgot the name, sorry. No, it's a very, like, you know, like Cruz Diaz, what Cruz Diaz does. Cruz Diaz, you know, Soto. Kinetic, yeah, exactly. Art. Sorry. So that was my first series of collages. I did while I was having a show in France. And so while their paintings were, it was a kind of it was a survey, but not a very big survey, show in this cultural center in Brittany. And so he offered me this possibility of waiting to the arrivals of the works, to have a studio and work and make some works. And then I decide, I always collect, I still have a collection of wrapped papers from the chocolate and candy papers, and shopping bags too. And so I decide, and I used to do like a Christmas card and birthday cards for my friends and the family. And then, but I had already been interested to make some works using this kind of materials. And then when he offered me, I said, oh, that's a good opportunity to have a stop and just being concentrated on collages, paper on paper. And then I did my first series there. And when I went back to Rio, I set a studio to make the collage. This is more, so I started in 2003, so since then, it has been growing. And then I make it, it's been more complex and more, my work is very rational, even it doesn't look like, but everything there, it has a reason to be. Even could be a crazy reason. But it's like, this is a very recent one, when actually the windows project I've been doing, that working with the lighting, natural light come through and work on the color, starts interfering too in the collages. And actually the candy, even I still use it. At the beginning, the first beginning of this, I really work with my collection of it, but then it finished. When I decided to continue to make collage, I needed to buy the chocolate and not to eat the candies. And that's like, and just to be possible, of course. Collage is very tough technically, I know you know that. And then I lost the interest because other papers became much more interesting for me. And then it's just a small part, these candy things. And so I went back to use my collection that comes from, is like well, now that became quite popular, that some people give to me, they collect for me, and then they give. So prints, the screen prints, it starts in, actually I work with the Durham Press, what is has been a great collaboration with John Paul Russell, what is the printmaker and the publisher in Pennsylvania, actually. And so we started in 96. So until 96, I was only a painter. And then when I start doing this screen prints, it's something that I always wanted to work with, but we don't have this kind of a studio that we could develop the image with the printmaker. And then so this tree was my very first. It took like almost 2 years for us to finish this edition. So the image that became an edition afterward. 97. And actually, I had like the Whitechapel in London. They organized a show with the kind of, it was a retrospective of all my collaboration. They have a catalog publisher only with this, the prints I've. So, at the beginning, the prints were just, they were like absorbing a lot of things from the paintings, And it was very hard for me when I always wished to work with screen prints, but when we start printing, and then I have this very flat, I don't know how many people here have seen my work on person, but actually has a lot of history there. It's very painterly. It even like sometimes in picture looks printed and people think it's printed. But not, it's very, I do myself everything. So it's very painterly. So this, the prints were very difficult at the beginning because when you print red is red, you print blue is blue, and then everything looks a Marlboro box in the end of the day. And then I wanted how to make it sophisticated. What Jean Paul was really great about it, because he understood me, that I wanted to work with prints in a more layering and building up the colors, what sometimes we have like some of the prints. This one is like a wood block around, actually the opposite, is the flower is a wood block and around the screen print. So this print is like it has hundreds entries on press, just for you to imagine how many layerings. And these are the last. Red pepper, sugar. So this is a coisa linda. I did two artist book. The first one was with MoMA in New York in 2000, was launched in 2002, and it was based on uh, 12 lyrics that I made a selection on Brazil. It was the editor of books there. That she suggests me, make us a bear. She suggests to me, why you don't do the books based on some of the musics. This one is the second one I did. That was published in London at the Reading House. And I based it in 3 pictures, actually. One from the Carnival, one of the sets of the Carnival movements, like a circular things that all schools of samba has. Another one, it was a plant that from the Bull and Max, one of ours also modern landscape design. And the other one was the sidewalks of Copacabana, what is this curve, and where I grew up too. This is the set designs I do. My sister has a contemporary dance company, and I do the sets for her since the beginning. So I've been doing it, yeah. Well, actually from that set that became, you see afterwards, when I started developing the kind of structure, I would not call sculpture yet, but it's a kind of a modular that's very much connected with an installation. And then this, what I was talking about, like the public, that was the first I did for the Selfridges department store. Actually, this building, the Selfridges in London is an old, I think, 19th century building or 18th century building. But then the architect who designed this, sorry, but I don't remember exactly his name, but the facade was designed for artists come and make some projects. And so I was the second artist. And then when I did, this is not printed, it's all cutouts. So I made the drawing on the architecture plan, and then I select from the swap of vinyl, adhesive vinyl, the colors, and then they, well, I do everything handmade, and then I have an assistant that she transforms my handmade drawings on computer drawings to blow up it afterward on the scale. It was at Tate Modern in London, like it's also like the restaurants they have at the 7th floor, has the view of London, both sides, for the one that don't know. They also have these two, one in front of another big walls that also is for site-specific. They invite the artists to site-specific. It's also the same technique. It's always the same technique. Peace and love. So that I did for the subway station, like Gloucester Road in London too. And then I work with motion. When the first proposal arrived, was a big, huge challenge for me. First, because I don't draw. Second, that I never really expected to work with spaces. And because I always would concentrate on this plan, my paintings, and you know, and so it was. I did the first one and have been invited after. It was very successful, the first one, and I really like it. And the result, I like it also the possibility of communicating with public, with a more open audience. What is like in the subway stations. It's like people so that was at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Tokyo. So all these projects needed to have a connection with the building. So sometimes people, when they see, they think, oh, I can do like something to this wall, with this window, or this thing, but that's not true. And I understood it afterwards, because I need the building and the site needed to motivate me to develop the project. That was Pinacoteca do Estado de São Paulo, what is a museum, maybe the best museum running now in Brazil. And I had a survey show in 2008, and they, in one of the rooms, I did this project for the windows. What it was the first time that I work with the natural light, like a stained glass things. It's always the vinyl translucent and transparent colors, but it was very important for me, this project, because it's like to following the changes of the light, the natural, the change of the lighting during the day, and it was really fantastic. That was when I had a solo show at the Cartier Foundation, Fondation Cartier pour l'Art Contemporain. For the ones that don't know the space, this is a kind of a glass house that the building, this foundation, the building, it's very important because all the shows are designed for, you need to design the whole space to install your work. And in my case that I have the paintings, all these were, the walls you see, it was designed to install the paintings. And then I have those windows, the glass, and then the director of the Fondation, he wanted me to do something for the windows. And that was the first time I put together the Windows projects and the paints in the same room, because at the Pinacoteca it was in separate room, and here it was the same room. So what I planned, it was like for the entrance, this window there, I leave that because you can see the shadow. It's like I made the drawing with like a kind of open areas, very opaque vinyl, and only leave the drawings what the light could come through. And if they reflect over the paintings, they will not make a change on the colors. That was my fear. And Samambaia was the one I did for the back, the other room, all ground floor, that works as color. And all, like when the light comes through, work could reflect the colors like at Pinacoteca. And then I have this huge collage that's 5 meters high by 4 meters that actually will be installed again at the Wexner Art Center in a group show next year. And then I could, so this, it was a very specific, I put there because actually from the set you saw, like I did to my sister dance company, I arrived on a piece that is using the same materials that from Carnival parades. These elements built a kind of installation with things, and here is I made with precious stones, because that was a special project that made with for Cartier, the jewelry. And this it was my show, like if is the end. So to show from the set becomes, I did this piece especially for this show, what also has the Gamboa seasons, what is like summer, spring, autumn, and winter. Actually, what happened is like when I always wanted to do a project with the seasons, what is something that motivated me to think about. And then it was the great experience, as the Fundação Bailey is a very big modern collection. And the Four Seasons has been a big traditional classical theme. So what was good about this project, it was the two things that introduced to my work. First, to make sketch, because in the way, first time I work with a team. I never really had teams before. And in the way you have a team, you needed to make sketch, what I also haven't done before. And when you make the sketch, and when I project everything, the image on the canvas, they are very big. It's like 15 meters, the whole panel, but it's like the first one with the summer. It's 5 meters. They all have 3 meters high. Sorry, that's in feet. I am terrible about it. But it's, so you can see here, like when you have the, and what happened is like, I was always motivated about the change of seasons, but then when I really stopped developing this project on the drawing, I figured out that I don't have actually experience. Of course, I've been spending time during the snow, different fall, and of course the summer thing, but it's not my, I didn't grow up experiencing it in my own town. And so I realized that always were kind of a fairy tale things that motivated me. And actually now I'm interested to do a work using my imagination about it. And then I decided to do it based on my own experience. That's why, and then the size came based on that. So summer, it's very, so in Brazil we have different, or in Rio at least, we have different kinds of heater. So summer was this big, spectacular, very like sun, strong and big on size. And then spring, a little smaller, and have like some small flowers communicating with the image of the big flower that would be the representation of spring. And fall, like another flower that started being a bit cold, like with the green and violet. And the winter was very narrow and a very different image to the others, as I work with the flowers motif in the other paintings. But this one is completely abstract, and then it's more, of course, connected with what I'm doing now. And it's strange, too, because actually the winter is strange that arrive in the city when it comes, even it's not exactly a winter. And it's a kind of a strange, people don't know what to do. And I have these horizontal lines on the fall and on the spring, because is when you can have a much more beautiful light. You could really see the horizon, the perspective on the landscape. What's during summer is too strong and too shine, so it's a kind of too exposure. Everything is too exposure to the thing. So I think that's it. I finished with that because unfortunately I didn't put any 2013 work for one day, next time. So thank you.
We have time for some questions.
Questions, yes, sorry.
That was wonderful. I feel
Thank you.
rejuvenated again. Thank you. I am wondering if you are interested in or identify with a feminist art practice. Does that come up? Do you think about that? Certainly some of the motifs for me suggest a historic association with certain feminist practices, and the collages in particular make me think about quilting as a practice, and some of the early work, there were even more overt references to a woman's sex, I thought. Could you comment on that?
To what? To the last word, sorry?
Could you comment?
No, before that.
Some of the early work suggested a woman's sex.
Women's sex, yeah. Okay. Well, actually, not really. The works were never really. I think I'm very political in my work when I really talk about my culture, being a woman and trying to be a painter and trying to bring the South America or Brazil, especially Brazil, to the first world or to the international art scene. So, and imposing kind of a freedom combination, kind of a free combination about how to think about painting. I think it's not, it's a kind of political statement. Even I don't base my work on that. I'm an abstract painter, and that's what I think is the most political thing I can do. But actually, what happened is like in Brazil history, art history, the women's has been important and has been, so we don't have, has been really important people in the whole context as they made the history, you know? And so I never really stopped thinking about it, because for me it was a natural continuation of this history to be involved with this team. But actually, when I start showing abroad, that changed, especially here. You know, like when I start showing, and that kind of a question start coming up to me. And of course, I knew about the feminism, and of course, I followed all that. But I never really felt any need to be connected with it, you know, in a way like I thought I had enough, like just present my work in the way and try to really take responsibility for what I done. It was enough. But then I understood that it's not that simple, and that it's not really, it's more complicated when you go to a more international field. And when the women are not exactly treated at the same level. And I think I'm talking about as an artist, when you really think about being intelligent, like you have really, you develop new concepts, new things that we don't go to this, especially on painting, you know, because I think painting is a very male word, still is, and it's bizarre because actually recently I received an article from someone that's from the Economist, the magazine, that was actually listing, also comparing the prices of women in the art market with men in the art market. And then when you really go and look more close to this, is unbelievable. Like the difference, the discrepancy. I don't know, I will not say it's just because it's a women thing, you know. I think, but something is not really well placed, I think. Something needed to change because the discrepancy is really unbelievable.
I'm wondering about where your studio is and like the size of it, and do you have people helping you? Do you, are you using like, I'm wondering what materials you're using on those collages right up there. I'm wondering about how the process happens. It seems to me like you have a extraordinary volume of work. Do you have like assistants helping you now, and like how does all this
actually,
what is the work about?
I actually in the studio, that is all painted, no? First, because even like it's all painted. It's not there are no collages. Even like the technique explained, it's based on the collage idea, and it's made with painting. So, and I have just one assistant help me in the studio, because I think on the painting, well, it depends. Like I have 4 assistants in total is working with me in the studio, but it's like administration. I have archivals and this that works on the images, like about digital for reproductions, or if I need like a handmade drawing become for these big projects on buildings. But in my studio, in my painting studio, I only have one assistant, and I do. This project was a kind of really crazy, because it took like 6 months, the gigantic canvas, and I was like going up and down on letters, and my studio has 2 floors. Actually, I have 2 studios, but it's like, and it's crazy, and people don't believe when they see that I did most of the things. Of course, my assistant, he helps me a lot on the heavy, like, you know, stretching and all these things, and also on my technique. He could layering behind to make it thicker, the image. So I have some helps, but I actually love painting. I like to be in the studio, and actually I like to be in the studio alone. I don't want to have a lot of people. I don't know how these painters made it, but I think it's like I really need to be alone to make it, to make decisions, to be there.
My other question is, what were you like as a child? What was your introduction to art? And did your parents support you with that? And how was that exploring, like, when you were growing up?
I had this, I was taking, actually, no, because my parents, my mother is an art historian teacher at the Rio University, so the state university, and then she retired from that job, and then she works with my sister at a dance company. And my father is a lawyer, but they were very interested in culture. So I grew up having that experience and pushing us to visiting museums, go to movies, and theater on a period of time that actually it was kind of because I grew up during the dictatorial time in Brazil. So and my parents, they tried to make our lives like normal, like in the way they were interested in culture, because during these kind of times, culture is the first thing to be vanished, And so it's like we had like whatever things happened about culture, we were there, And at home, they are books, and they always trying to make our lives interested in art. But as a child, I never really had anything different than any other child as making exceptional drawings or something like that. No, I was pretty normal. And just, well, between quotations probably. That's like the connection I have, what I actually afterwards, as like I like it to make, to design my own clothes, and from my doll's clothes to like myself, because my grandmother used to make our clothes before, and then I could design to her. So actually, I think like makes sense afterwards my interest in fashion design, and try to use applied art as a reference to my paintings. So yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
You said earlier that it was important for you to take responsibility for being an abstract painter, for abstract painting. And I'm really interested in that, especially when I look at your work, there's so many strong flower images, and can you just comment a little bit more about that? Why taking on this, claiming it to be abstraction, why that's so important?
Well, because I think, first of all, I think all paintings have done the abstract, because I think it's like what fascinates me in paintings were just like this, exactly, I could build up my own words, my own, that only would exist there, and this white canvas is always very attractive for that kind of thing. But it's like, and then there's abstraction, because actually whatever painting wants to do, whatever meanings, concepts, it should be the meaning or the way to think about the process is always based on abstraction, because it's like needs to work as a structure, color, like whatever expression you want to. That's why, well, of course, from that point to really become abstract. What I don't know if I am, maybe, this is, of course you look and it says it's a flower, but I use the flowers as, it needs to work as a shape, as a color, as a form, otherwise it would never work. And so that's also why I wanted to develop my own images, because I wanted to put my hands on certain aspects of the painting that I could not using existing images from the collage, from the papers or fabrics. And so these, I think I like abstraction. I love like, no, I love like still lifes and portraits. And actually some of my paintings I showed it were based on that kind of a compositional structure. But I never would be able to represent it or to work with it like visually, that you'd see a real portrait a real basket with fruits. And it's like actually, Ivo Mesquita, the director of Pinacoteca de São Paulo, he said to me, like, I think the most Brazilian things I have is the freedom to put together different kinds of elements that come from different and build up a kind of order. And I think probably is the most interesting heritage I have from my culture is this one. It's this kind of a mix and freedom.
I was wondering, do you work on one piece at a time and then you finish it, or do you work on a bunch of them at the same time, or how does it?
I work normally around 3 paints at the same time, because 3 to 4, because also because of the technique, because this technique is very slowly processed, and it's difficult to understand how it means the technique without seeing, I know, and then, but it's a small pieces, so, and it needs to have layers behind to make it thicker. After I finish the images, I need to layer it and make it thicker, and then if I glue it on canvas, it's like 12 hours to dry, and so it's a long process. And on top of everything, of course, the time for me to think about, so it takes a long time too. And it's good to have more than one painting, because you let the painting breathe, and have its own time to work. Because it's like I was talking with a student today, like the ideal is when you dialogue with the paint, and it's a nice dialogue, but not always we are able to do it. So, but it's good to to just leave at certain point that you don't know what to do, and you don't want to destroy what you have done because you think something is interesting, just let the paint there. So I think we need time. Actually, we need time for many things, but for painting, definitely, time is a very good partner to our job in the studio.
Good evening. I'm trying to form coherent questions, so I think I have 2. One is, I'm really struck, you've been talking about your work as being political, and so I'm curious to hear a little bit more what you mean about that, especially given the political and cultural history of Brazil. And then second, I've been in Brazil recently. I have family in Curitiba, and I guess one of the things I was struck by in my last visit was how different the personalities of the city are. And clearly Rio has made such a big impact on your work, and could you speak a little bit more of that? And is your art situated as an artist from Rio, or do you really feel like you're in dialogue with different types of art going on in Brazil? I'm not for disclaimer, I'm not an art student, so perhaps that explains my my lack of information on that.
No, it's so the first question, I think the first thing, the first question, I always work concentration on painting, not to be political or have this, even I was involved with politics myself as a person, not as an artist, during many times in Brazil. But many years during my youth, especially my student time until a certain point. But I will maybe answer your question when I say something that Robert Storr, the curator, Mama probably you know him, and said once when he came to my studio, he said, Beatriz, you are really it's unbelievable what happened, because as a woman, using applied and decorative art as a subject, pretending to be a painter from South America, and then now you are on the cover of Art Now from Taschen. He said, that's spectacular. I think that answers a little bit your questions, because actually I walked through against everything almost, because as a woman trying to pick up these elements and motifs, trying to make a painting works using this motif. If I was a man, maybe it would be the artwork would observe with a different perspective. But as a woman, you immediately were inside the kind of a terrible box, no, probably. And so, so that I thought I took it as a compliment from his side. Well, the second thing, actually is a good question, because many people, exactly because our art history is not so known out of Brazil, and so many people think I'm part of a kind of because they have the idea that South America in general, Spanish or Portuguese like Brazil, very colorful, very work with colors and come from colors or something. So when they look at my works, they connected it sometimes, it's not your case, I'm just like, they think I became from a heritage of painting and colors developers, what actually is not. Because I'm a kind of alone inside Brazil doing what I do. Because our major, we have painting, like I told, like how we have Tarsila, we have in the modern times, we had some strong painters. But if you see their pictures, it's not exactly what I do. It's like actually people, especially international people, they feel they have difficulties. You understand why I connected my work with their work. And then actually, like from this time, we have the constructivism. What's kind of important, some conceptual and political art, like Cildo Meirelles from the 70s, and we have Ligia Clark from the 50s, and then it's concrete art. And so that use colors, but in a very geometric, that of course you can link from that point of geometry, but I don't think so exactly what I do. And also, it's not exactly painting. I think the medium that is the strongest, I think we are more on objects, installations, conceptual art, and are more strong in terms of our art history.
I was in Rio in September, and I went through your show twice.
Ah, yeah.
I ate lunch, and then I went back.
Great, yeah.
And then afterward, I thought that your work should be in the city. I mean, one of the things that disappointed me about Rio is that it's very gray. I mean, there's a lot of stucco, there's a lot of concrete, there's some greenery in some places, but in other places, the concrete is unrelieved. There's nothing else to break it up. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about public art projects using your colors and designs for Rio.
Yeah, we are very poor about public art. I was actually, this weekend, I took like a break, I arrived on Friday in Chicago, and I'm interested in architecture. It's not by chance that I decided to take this break this weekend here, just on my own. And I think it has been developed so well, this kind of a communication, which is very rare, actually, all over the world, about public art and urban design and architecture. Like, it's such a difficult things to make it happen. And I think Chicago, the ones I've seen, it's a very beautiful example of how you could make it happen in a very interesting way. Yeah, Rio, we don't really have any serious project about it. I think one of the reasons is the beauty of the nature, because it's like this part of Rio, the part that everybody knows and want to be. So my studio is next to the Botanic Garden, and so always being there. And so I have this kind of nature around me, and I live close to the beach, so I have the beach, and so it's you don't really miss on that area. But of course, Rio is much bigger than that, and I think out of these landscapes and the nature, beauty, strong beauty we have there, we could develop very important and very interesting public art. And there were people before trying to do it, but never really work out for different reasons. And I hope one day. Because once they have, I mentioned the nature, because actually, once they try to do it, they instead of going to areas that you said, that's more unknown areas, that's more grayish, not so beautiful, and a very chaotic, some urban chaos, and trying to make it more interesting, they go to the beautiful areas and try to make a public art there. The competition is impossible. You cannot compete with a beautiful lake. You cannot compete with the ocean, and it's very difficult to compete with all these mountains and greens and trees. So it's the other way around to go, I think, you know.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.